Hello and welcome to Cards for the Curious, a storytelling card and dice game inspired by the curious fiction of M.R. James. It's a lovely copy of his work that I got for Christmas. And the game is also inspired by the excellent podcast, A Podcast to the Curious by Will Ross and Mike Taylor, which you can pick up on iTunes. So, it's a copy of the game. It is for probably ages from around 10 and up. It lasts for about 30 to 45 minutes. It takes about 5 minutes to set up once you get fairly quick at it. And in the game, you play the role of a protagonist from one of the famous M.R. James ghost stories. And if you know M.R. James ghost stories, things always start out fairly okay to begin with, and then the protagonist usually uncovers something terrible or something happens, and slowly but surely an impending dread starts to hunt him down. So the aim of the game is to stay ahead of this impending dread before the resolution of the final encounter, otherwise you'll be doomed to insanity or death. So I will be showing a video of how to set up the game and just how it plays, but there's a complete rule book that's included in the game. You get 15 dice, you get a load of player markers, you get tons of cards, there's about 95 different cards that you get. So every time you set up a story, it will run differently each time, so there's great replayability. And you get a story tracker board which slots together, which helps you see the gap between yourself and the impending dread, so until you get to that final encounter. So hopefully you'll really enjoy the game, and if you've got any questions or feedback, then just contact me on the address on the rulebook. Enjoy! Okay, so we have the deck set up here for a game of Cards for the Curious, and this is for the story pack "Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad," written by M.R. James. So I've set up all the decks up here, and this is the threat track and fortitude track. The impending dread, trimmed by this marker here, is starting on its opening square there, and the protagonist marker for the character of Parkins, the professor, I'm going to put him starting on the moderate starting point on the tracker board. There's various starting points depending on how difficult you want to make the game. And I'm also setting this marker, which is going to measure how much fortitude dice I have left. I'm going to start that on the very first square, number 32, because I've got 32 dice to manage through the game for fortitude, and that'll be dwindling as I use it up through the game. Okay, the game is going to flow fairly automatically. We start by turning over the first story card, and what you'll see is it has a picture and some flavour text, which is extracts taken from the M.R. James story itself, and it gives us an instruction. It will either tell us to go to a certain location, turn over another story card, move one of the markers, or it may indicate a fortitude threat. In this case, we've got a red label here telling us to go to the globe location, which is over here, which is the inside public location deck. So once we've dealt with that card and read it, we'll just put it into the discard pile, and we start turning over cards in the public location deck. Now these cards are made up of good and bad cards, and these are things that could happen. They're not directly related to the story, but they're things that we can imagine happening at this moment in the globe inn. So the first card we've turned over is a foreboding card, and there's a lot of those in the deck, and those are things that will cause the protagonist a certain amount of ill ease depending on how severely he feels it. So this one is a bizarre curio. Okay, so the first thing we need to do, I'll just put that down there, is to find out what the threat is. So we're going to roll 3 black dice. I've just got a little thing to roll them in here, and any 1s to 3s, 1, 2 or 3, count as a threat. So I rolled that, and unfortunately, if you can see here, I've got 2 1s and a 3. So the threat here they're all going to count. So this card will also tell me what my uplift dice is. If we see there, this one says Antiquarianism. So I look on my attribute board for Parkins and it tells me that his Antiquarianism is 3, and that was set by the story setup card. So that means I've got 3 dice that I can roll to try and counter these threats. So I pick up 3 red dice and I roll them. But unfortunately, I've got to get 5s or 6s to try and counter these threats. So I've rolled, I've got a 3, 4 and a 5, if you can see there. So only one of those is going to count, so this 5. So I've managed to cancel out one of the threats, but the other 2, unfortunately, are still there. So I'm going to have to send my protagonist marker back for Parkins 2 squares on the tracker board. So as you can see, when bad things happen, he's moving towards these darker squares towards the impending dread. The impending dread's going to be moving this way. So we want to keep as big a distance as possible between them. Okay, so not a good start. So we turn over the next card in the glow bin. And this is one of the favour cards. So what that's telling us, there's 11 of these in the game, and these are things we can keep into our hand and play anytime we want. This one allows us to re-roll some dice, so I'll be keeping that one in my hand back here. So those are very beneficial to use. So we pick the next card, and this one is, oops, upside down, is a favourable card. So there's not many of these, but they're very good when we get them. And this is a friendly local. And again, it will tell me an uplift dice, this time sociability. So we'll put that down there. So there's no threat involved in a favourable card, but I've got an opportunity to try and make this a good experience. So I can roll my sociability dice, which unfortunately for Parkins isn't very high, it's just 2. Started off as 1 and I put 1 extra dice on it, as I'm allowed to do from the start. So any 5s or 6s will move me up the board. Okay, so I got a 1 and a 5. So I can move up 1 square because of that 5, any 5s or 6s. So a good experience chatting to her in the pub. So I moved up 1. So onto the next card. So unfortunately here we've got another foreboding card. This time it's a vicious rat that we seem to have encountered in the inn. Now we'll roll to see what his the threat of this rat is. So again 3 dice. And I've got a 6, a 4 and a 3. Now let's for the sake of this game, let's imagine that was a threat of 3. Let's say it was very bad. If I looked on my natural science, which is what the uplift dice is for this card, if you can see there, it's natural science. I've only got a natural science for Parkins of 1. So this is going to be very difficult because I'd be only rolling 1 dice to try and cancel out 3 threats. So what I've got an option of doing is putting this card in my hand, keeping it back here, and rolling 1 dice for my natural science and 7 dice for my rationality. So 8 dice in all. 5, 6, 7, 8. So I've got a much better chance now of cancelling some of these threats out. Unfortunately I only got 1 6 there, so at least I cancelled 1 of them out, so I'd moved back 2 on the threat board, on the threat tracker. Now you might think, well, why wouldn't you do that all the time? The problem is I have to keep that in my hand, the rat card, and the next time I draw a foreboding card. So let me just look down and pick one up. So for example, if I pick this one now, a puzzling cryptogram, instead of rolling 3 black dice for the threat, as I normally do, because I've got a foreboding card in my hand, I'd have to roll 4 dice. So the threat is likely to increase. Now I can keep up to 2 of these foreboding cards in my hand, but after that I'm not allowed to keep any more. But there are ways of getting rid of them, because otherwise your threat is always rolling 4 dice instead of 3. If I pass down the board, it's important this way, so negatively, past one of these lightning bolt symbols, then that allows me to get rid of one of the foreboding cards from my hand. And likewise, if the impending dread moves down the board and goes past a lightning bolt, again bad situation, then again that allows me to get rid of one foreboding card. So there are ways of managing that. So it's a good strategy, but only to be used now and again. Now, if we just carry on with this deck, so the next card I've got is a specifics card. So that is a card specifically relating to the story "O Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad," and it's Colonel Wilson, and he gives me 2 fortitude dice, so that's something to keep in my hand when I need it, so that's a good one. Next card I've turned over is it's another favourable card, which is good. And this one, instead of actually rolling to see how favourable it is, it's a relaxing time for writing. It actually tells me just to move my protagonist 1 square up the threat track. So a good experience automatically, so I can move 1 up. So they're very good, those cards. Going on to the discard pile. And take the next card, which is a scene card. Now these are cards which tell us to go to the story card deck. So we're back into the actual story that M.R. James wrote. So we're going to put that down there. And we're going to turn over the next story card. And these story cards, as I said before, will tell us either to move one of the markers or to go to another location. So this one's telling us to move the protagonist 1 square up the track because he's playing golf, which is a good experience. And it tells us to go to the outside location. So I'd move my little marker to the outside location deck, and I would carry on there. So I'll put that in the discard pile, and then I'd start picking up cards from the outside location deck. So basically the game will continue like that until scene cards will direct me to the story cards. Story cards will do things which will direct me back to the location decks. But if I move through some of these story cards quickly without showing you, I'll just illustrate what will happen. We will come across these things called fortitude threats, and these are the most serious things in the game, and these will come up quite frequently on the story cards. And this is where the impending dread is actually getting involved with the protagonist in the story. So this is the incident where Parkins is looking behind him on the beach and can see this figure possibly following him. And it tells us the fortitude threat. We don't have to roll for that. It's a fortitude threat of 3. So I'm going to put that down there. Now, as I said from the beginning, I've got 32 dice that I can use through the game, so I have to manage how seriously I think that threat is. So I might choose to roll 4 dice. So I'd count down here, 1, 2, 3, 4. So my marker's gone down to 28. I can roll 4 of the red dice, and again any 5s or 6s will cancel out that threat. Right, I've got none. So unfortunately that would mean the impending dread moving down 4 squares on the track threat. So quite a serious problem there. He's obviously coming closer to me. Okay, so there are cards that will allow us to re-roll fortitude dice, but so we have to manage this fortitude throughout the game. So basically the protagonist is probably going to be moving this way, and the impending dread getting closer and closer as the game goes on. Now if you survive this long, you will get to the 16th story card, and the 16th card is always the final encounter with the impending dread, and the fortitude threat is always 6, so it's the most serious threat we get in the whole game. And this will tell us whether we're going to win or lose at this point. If we're still alive at this point, or still have our sanity. So the only difference now, when we roll our remaining dice, so let's for example say that we had 5 fortitude dice left, we'd roll them all, but we might have the Colonel Wilson card, for example, that I showed you earlier. He gives us another 2 dice, so we could be rolling 7 dice to try and counter this threat of 6. The only difference on the final encounter is that if I roll any 1s on a dice, they count towards the impending dread. So he gets to move for those his threat could increase. So I've rolled, well, had a good roll here. 3 6s and 2 5s, so those all counter the threat. But let me say, for example, I'd rolled a couple of 1s as well. So Fortitude threat of 6 would now become 8 because of those 1s, but I will have cancelled out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 8 minus 5 would be 3, and the impending dread would move 3 places up here, and he hasn't landed on me or overtaken me, so I would win the game and survive. If I hadn't been so successful in my rolls and been a couple short and only rolled 3 5s or 6s, he would have had those extra 2 spaces he could have moved and would have either overtaken me or landed on me, in which case I would lose the game. So that's basically how the game works. The instructions will go through all this in much more detail, but hopefully showing it on the board will demonstrate how the game works. So you then need to look at the story setup card. This is the one for O Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, and it will give all the details of what you need to do. So the first thing is to set up the player attribute board for the protagonist. So this is the one that we're going to use, and we're going to set this up for Parkins. So put that down there. We'll have a starting rationality of 7. That's what all characters have. We'll put his name marker in there. Now he's starts with a sociability of 1, so that's very weak. That means we're only going to be rolling 1 dice for sociability. He's got linguistics of 4, being a professor, that's 4, that's a maximum. We've got antiquarianism of 3, so quite high, and natural science of 1. So let's set up the player attribute board there. At the beginning of the game I can change one of these markers up by 1, unless it's already at its maximum. So I'm going to change natural science and put that up to 2. Now the next thing to do is to take the base set cards. There's 72 of these cards, okay, and on the reverse of these cards you'll see different combinations of colours. So you might have one that's got all the colours on, like this one here. It's got the red, yellow, blue and green, and those represent different types of locations that could be in the story. So the yellow represents inside private location decks. The green represents outside private locations, so it could be like a garden or something like that. The inside might be, for example, a room in the inn. The red is inside public location, like the inn itself, or it could be cathedral. So these all apply to all M.R. James stories. And the blue is for outside public locations, so that could be walking on the beach, playing around a golf, could be anywhere outside. So a card that's got all of these colours on the back could fit any of these decks. Whereas this card, just with the blue and the red, that could only go in the inside public or the outside public location deck. So there's different combinations on the back. So the first thing we have to do is to look on the story setup card, and it will tell us on the back here which decks are going to be used. So for this particular story we're going to be using yellow, blue and red. There isn't an outside private location in the game, so that can be put to one side, but we'll use the markers for the other 3 location types. So the yellow is being used for the room in the Globe Inn, the blue for the beach, walking around, playing a game of golf, and the red for the Globe Inn itself. And it will tell us, so we can start with the yellow deck for the inside private location. It tells us how many cards to build from the base set. So I need 11 cards which have got a yellow on the back at some place, so I'll just count these out. So that gives me 11. And the next one is blue, and I need 11 blue ones. So I'm going to keep counting till I get 11 that have got blue on the back. 11, so those have all got blue somewhere on the back. And finally red, which is the biggest deck. I need 23 cards for this one. So okay, so I've got my 3 decks built up from the base set cards. Now what I need to do is add the favour cards. There's 11 of these favour cards, so these are good things that could happen in the game that we can keep these in our hand to use to help us strategize. And we're going to shuffle in there the 4 specific cards that come with the game, with this story pack. So these happen to be 3 Colonel Wilson cards and a lantern. So those are going to be shuffled in. So we know we've got some good things that are going to come up. And again, similarly, these have different colour combinations on the back. And it will tell us in the story card setup how many to put in each deck. So there's 4 to go in the yellow. And again, I need to make sure they've got yellow somewhere on the back. 4 to go in the blue, and 7 to go in the red. Okay, so I'm just going to shuffle those in there, make sure they're well shuffled. And we're nearly there now. All we need to do now is to put in the 8 scene cards. Now these scene cards will drive the story because they'll tell us when to actually read out the story cards to follow what's actually happening in the story. So again, it will tell us on the story card setup how many to put in each deck. So there's 2 in the yellow, 2 in the blue, and 4 in the red. Now, rather than shuffle them in, this is the most important part, is all we've got to do is split this deck that we've got at the moment into as many pieces as we have scene cards. We've got 2 scene cards to go in, so we need to just split it into 2 roughly equal piles and put 1 in each. And shuffle each part so we don't know exactly where it is in there. And then place 1 on top of the other. All that, the purpose of that is so that we don't get both scenes right at the top of the pack, which would mean the game would finish very quickly. It means they're roughly going to come in, 1 in the somewhere in the top and 1 somewhere in the bottom. And you do exactly the same for the blue deck. So split that into 2 halves and put 1 in each. And again, you shuffle that up and put 1 on top of the other. And the red deck, because we've got 4 scene cards to go in there, just create a bit of space, we can actually split this into 4 piles. So again, just as long as they're roughly equal. And again, there'll be 1 scene card to go in each. Again, shuffle them up. And just put 1 on top of the other. So those 4 scene cards are roughly distributed throughout the deck. And that gives us our 3 location decks for the blue, red and yellow decks. And then basically we're ready to start the story.